Our next guest is Sarah Rosier. Sarah is another one of our Ballotpedia All-Stars. And Sarah is the Congress Project Director. Congress is a project, so trying to be the director of that has to be fairly daunting. And one of the issues that Sarah has been tracking is this notion that although we may not be seeing a competitive level at the general elections, we're seeing an increasing level of competitiveness at the primary elections, particularly the congressional primary elections. So Sarah, tell us, what does it mean to be the Congress Project Director?
So on Ballotpedia, we've been tracking incumbents and candidates since we started in 2012. Not only candidates and incumbents now, we're also starting to track issues and trends that we're seeing in both elections and in the actual bills and the happenings of Congress themselves.
And one of the things you've decided to track is this notion of competitiveness.
Yes.
Right. So what kind of data do you look at for something like that?
So for this study, we looked at any incumbent who was facing a primary challenge. So we separated it out from, if there was a Republican incumbent, we didn't really look at the Democratic primary. We really focused on whether or not those incumbent congressmen and women were facing primary challenges.
And what is the data telling you?
Of the 393 incumbents that ran for re-election in 2012, only 192 actually faced a challenge, which is less than 50%. Only 48.6% faced no primary challenge.
And you said, is most of this on the Republican side, or is it mixed, Republican and Democrat?
The top 10 who actually did face a primary, who came the closest, which was a margin of victory of under 10 percentage points, 7 of the 10 were Republican primaries. So we definitely are seeing increased competition on the Republican side.
So when you define competitiveness, you're not just looking at whether or not someone has an opponent, you're looking at whether or not they actually have a meaningful opponent, I take it.
Yes, we looked at both factors, and only, 7.69% of those who even faced a primary challenge, those were the only amount of people who were under 10% or less.
But even though you may not see a lot of challenges, you're saying there are an increasing number of challenges. That the number of challenges, as bad as the number is, it's actually getting a little better.
Yes.
So what do you attribute that to?
We're seeing, it is interesting because 2010, despite the Tea Party wave, despite the excitement around primaries and, anti-establishment rhetoric, we saw 66 less primaries in 2010 than we did in 2012, which means that this new batch of congressmen who were elected in 2010 are keeping up more with the scorecards. They're looking at more, what are the interest groups kind of pressuring us to do? So there's an increased focus on, all right, how do we really stick with our base to make sure that any primary challenge is met with, well, hey, look at how I voted on the shutdown, or hey, look at my civil liberties votes, or stuff like that. So we're definitely seeing an increase of mindfulness of what the base is feeling.
And how much of the increased competition, to the extent there is such a thing, do you think is a result of the redistricting?
Well, we are noticing that the big races are happening now in the primaries. We just released a battleground study that shows that only 29 districts will actually really be competitive in the 2014 elections. So that means that the majority, by far, of districts, over 400 districts, will really be decided in the primaries. And I think voters are starting to see that the only way to make a real true change is going to be through the primary system.
Well, that's a staggering number, or a frightening number. So what you're saying is you are predicting, however you go about predicting, that of all the congressional races next year, and just to remind our viewers, every congressperson has to run every 2 years, correct? It's not like the Senate. So every congressperson will be up for re-election, 435 if my memory serves me correctly. Of 435 possible elections, only 29 are going to be competitive in the general election?
Yes, that is what we concluded. We did a very broad study on lots of different factors. We included other third-party groups such as Cook, who is famous for their PVI and percentage of voter index where they predict their districts. We also use presidential margin of victories, which have really shown a difference between 2008 to 2012. We can see how the district is trending after the redistricting happened in 2010. We also used incumbency rate, since incumbency, we call it king. Incumbency is king in these House races. You're much more likely to be winning a race if you've been in there a long time. So when we threw all these factors together, we ranked each district of how competitive it truly was. And we found that compared to what other places are saying, really, unless something catastrophically changes these numbers, only 29 really have a true chance of changing hands.
Well, I know we came today to talk about primaries, but that number for generals is just frightening. It's just very frightening.
It is.
So going back to the primaries, and again, you said there's an increasing level of competition. Historically, it's said that during an off presidential year, and next year is an off presidential election year, that there are more changes in Congress, more shifts in Congress. So how important is it, and what do you predict would be the result of being an off-year election in terms of this primary competitiveness? How do you see that playing out?
I think the midterms elections were more able to be swung before redistricting. However, the House is already a Republican majority, and normally midterms are really reflected on the popularity of the president. So because Obama's popularity rate is lower because of the Obamacare and the recent news surrounding that, there's a chance for Republicans to pick up a few more seats. I don't see a wave happening in either way for the House. However, the Senate will be interesting in 2014. There are 33 regular election seats up and 2 special elections that will also happen on November 4th. And those definitely have more of a chance of swinging one way or another. There are quite a few blue senators in very red states. So, for example, West Virginia, Senator Rockefeller is retiring. So that'll now be an open seat that has the possibility of a Republican pickup. There will also be Senator Kay Hagan in North Carolina. That's one example of a Democratic senator in a pretty Republican state. So I think the swing may happen more in the Senate than in the House this election cycle.
So you mentioned there's an incumbent who won't be running who's a Democrat. Does that predict, from your perspective, does that necessarily predict that the Democrats will have a competitive primary, or not necessarily?
Right now, that one's not looking too competitive. It's been interesting to try to track some of these open seats in red states. Montana's another example. Senator Max Baucus is retiring, and we've seen a little bit of confusion thus far in the Democratic primary as to who's going to step up and run, because they're going to be such hard-fought battles.
Now, one of my personal theories that we're going to investigate on this program, hopefully quite a bit, is the notion that we need competitiveness and probably need a third party to make things competitive. Now, the Tea Party is not a third party. They may become one. They're not one now. How does the advent of the Tea Party add to this new layer of competitiveness?
I think as we saw the wave of new members come in 2012, there has been this more of, all right, we're going to key vote this certain bill. So the one example I'll always go back to is the shutdown. You had non-establishment, non-leadership members crying, shut it down, shut it down. Heritage Action got involved in the fray, and normally they were less to the right than other Senate conservative funds and Club for Growth, but they were even screaming, shut it down, shut it down. So it was interesting to see how the members were responding to that, because if they weren't voting, there were calls for, all right, who can we get to challenge Cornyn, for example, in Texas? He didn't vote for cloture, or he did vote for cloture. How can you really stick it to him after he didn't follow his constituents' votes and cries for shutting it down, kind of thing? I think we'll see more of that as we get closer to the election. There's going to be a pretty big divide within the Republican Party over issues like that. And this recent trend of, your member only voted 75% of the time with the Tea Party wing will definitely come into play for primaries going forward.
Do you also see perhaps that pendulum within the Republican Party swinging back a bit? So in other words, let's say a proponent of an advocate of the Tea Party principles was elected last time. Do you see the more moderate element of the Republican wing wanting to now run someone in the primary to more or less take back their turf?
I know that's come up a few times. Justin Amash in Michigan will be facing a more establishment, more moderate challenger. I don't see how much traction that's going to pick up because so much of the pressure in primary is coming more from the further right than from the middle. I know there was talk of, oh, you know, in Indiana, for example, Murdoch lost in the general election after ousting Lugar in the primary, and there's calls from Karl Rove types about this is why, you know, this is why the Tea Party can't have nice things kind of deal there. But I don't see more moderate candidates getting as much traction in a primary against a Tea Party, or just because the incumbency, they're now considered the incumbents, and they are giving a lot of these constituents what they're looking for.
Well, based upon your data, I think there's some hope in the fact that there is some increased competitiveness. But I think what I'm also hearing from you is there's a ceiling there. I mean, we are not headed to an environment of a competitive political world, just a marginally better competitive world.
Right. It's really scary to think that Congress approval ratings are hitting record lows, but people are so willing to say, no, not my congressman. My congressman isn't the fault. It's District 5 or whatever it may be. It's never people's own congressman, but really, you know, if anybody's looking for fresh blood and they look at the approval ratings, it's still pretty dismal.
Yeah, that's the classic explanation. It's Congress is bad, but my congressperson's okay.
Yeah.
Sarah, so you run the Congress Project for Ballotpedia. For our listeners, if anyone wants to become active, drill down and get more information on what you're doing, study this issue better, how do they get to Ballotpedia? How do they track what you're doing?
So you'll just go to ballotpedia.org, and on the homepage, you'll be able to click on the Congress link, and that'll take you to all things Congress. We have a myriad of studies up now, links to any election you'd want to see in 2014. We're really picking up our coverage at this point. So feel free to contact me. You can do that through Ballotpedia as well.
And again, all your information will be continuously updated, so whether it's heading into the primary or the general, they can go to your site and get up-to-the-minute data on the races, who's running, etc.
Yes. Yep.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Always appreciate the insights of the people from Ballotpedia. Thank you.